say an immediate family member. So, but that my trafficker is still alive. But it sounds very much, and exactly that's one of the things that I've gotten a lot of pushback, even in terms of the PhD program. People are like, well, you're a criminologist. And like, no, I'm not. I'm a gender-based researcher, because so much of this, in my experience, and this is Keith and I've talked about this so much, is that patriarchal norms of sex being available to men at any time, or this is the predication of all of this, you know, in terms of how do we think of children? You know, how do we think of kids as disposable? You know, some kids, even though we don't want to talk about that, there are some kids who are considered disposable, you know, or even in terms of, I can definitely see down the line my research including judges, in terms of buyers, when we're looking at demand, it's like you just get a slap on the wrist. You know, there's no, so much of this is based on patriarchal norms. And so that's what, even with child sex trafficking legislation, it's so incremental, like it's exactly the tip of the iceberg. There's so much going on, and yet, I don't know, it's part of me feels a little bit hopeful, particularly within the terms of the Me Too movement. One of the decriminalization advocates that I spoke to, who was also a survivor, she's talking, she said, it's like, well, human trafficking is the Me Too movement writ large. You know, that was a quote. So even though I might not have immediate answers for you, I definitely hear you and what you're, in terms of your frustration. 100%. I think even the narrative of the way we're talking about this will evolve over time. I've been shocked to see how much it's changed in the 20 years since I've been doing this work, but hopeful that it'll change even more. So yeah, I look forward to talking to you. Thank you.
And actually, I just wanted to thank you for bringing up the issue of demand and how we're looking at demand and how that actually really does directly relate to what we're doing with recognizing victimization, because we actually see this in our, part of what we look at in our framework is we also look at whether the crime of sex trafficking includes the crime of buying sex with a child. And states are not consistent about this, even though the federal law is. And what that does is it fails to recognize, when we don't recognize that buyer is committing a serious crime, we don't see the child as a victim of a serious crime. So there's a direct correlation. It's two sides of the same coin. We have to work on it. Yeah, but, and we also see it come up in the advocacy context of where legislators, when we're struggling with kind of on the demand side, we will also struggle with recognizing victims in that state too.
One observation with your data analysis, and then a broader question that either you or Christine can answer. I think it's important to keep in mind that state task forces are typically statutorily defined. So what you might be measuring in the presence of a state task force is actually a legislative action to authorize that state task force.
I can speak now.
Something to be thinking about, and then so just something to be thinking about. The question for you though is thinking beyond the main argument. Often those of us who work on criminal justice related policy issues spend a lot of time thinking about unintended consequences of legislative priorities. So my question to you is, what do you foresee as some of the potential unintended consequences of legislation at the state level to remove criminal penalties associated with minors involved in prostitution?
Did you want to take all the questions?
Yeah.
Hi, Sarah Cambu, President of ICRW. Thank you to all the panelists for just fantastic presentations. Now, Kate, I know that you've got miles to go before you sleep, but I think you've also got an amazing opportunity. First of all, you cite the Me Too movement, and I just think a national hunger for authenticity and voice. And so can imagine, what you've listed there as really collecting stories appropriately presented, respectful, with dignity, etc. But helping people be touched by this issue is, I think you've got an amazing window right now. And while I was following, some of the recommendations that would likely come out, and I would love to see, how you refine that at the end of the research. I think you've got 2018 and 2020. And so how, could you and others within the community, what could be preparations in terms of reaching out to some potential champions, governors, state legislators, I mean, you've got a great target list, if you will, of probably where you've got tipping points. But is that possible for you to consider as you move forward?
We have questions online?
I'll start with one for now.
Okay.
Melanie from Swap Behind Bars is asking, are there any current empowerment style re-entry models specifically focused on survivors, workers that are leading the way in criminal justice reform? Some time.
Yeah, I'll speak to the task forces. It's absolute. There's such a wide array of task forces. And so honestly, how I created the variable was, I believe was it 2009 DOJ funded the first like group of task forces. And then since it's also often a big part of Safe Harbor is that there has to be a task force created as well. And some are grassroots movements. So as you're talking about this and as we're really getting through the data, as task forces continue to emerge is so important. Keith has been so great about having me break down, like this, that would be a wonderful breakdown of like which task forces are legislated, which are grassroots, is there a difference in terms of that? Even in terms of Safe Harbor, some states have Safe Harbor and fully decriminalized. Some states don't have Safe Harbor, but fully decriminalized. And so that's one thing I haven't talked about here. But in terms of what does that, within the variables that are so significant, breaking down differences within those variables, how does that even look different? Same thing with concentrated disadvantage. Okay, so I did an aggregated concentrated disadvantage, which was all 6 variables that are part of William Julius Wilson's concentrated disadvantage, but then I disaggregated them. And so what does that look like? So task force, that would be a great idea to do that as well. And then forgetting the second part of your question.
Unintended consequences.
Unintended consequences. I think the biggest thing when you're asking about that, it makes me think of exactly what decriminalization advocates are nervous about in the face of, okay, so if everyone were to decriminalize right now, okay, so how are children going to get services? How, within Massachusetts, I know My Life, My Choice got a wonderful grant to work with Department of Children and Families. They have very much of a multidisciplinary response. Minnesota is the exact same. It's called No Wrong Door. So as soon as any child is identified, they're put into services. That takes a lot of infrastructure and a lot of money. And so I absolutely understand this. People say our state isn't ready, we need to do this. And at the same time, but then to Christine's point, that yes, but decriminalizing would that then push them, in terms of the
right. And actually, just to build on that, in terms of Minnesota's approach, Minnesota created urgency by enacting the non-criminalization law and pushing out the effective date 3 years, and basically gave the legislature 3 years to get their funding in place, so that when that law went into effect. And the thing is we've actually heard from advocates on the ground that law enforcement actually started implementing the law before they're actually required to, because this was just this is where it's going. So they put that goalpost in the ground and said this is where we need to be, and let's all work on getting there, which is the new law.
Yeah. And that said, Minnesota is not, it's seen in some ways as the gold standard state, and at the same time, it's not perfect, and I'm concluding that.
And that's the thing. I mean, we are, a colleague of mine always says that we are building the plane as we fly.
Yes.
And so much of this is enacting, implementing, learning from implementation. Florida is an excellent example of that narrative of coming back every 2 years, really refining the legislation, and there's still work to do. Nobody's got it completely figured out, unfortunately.
Any other question?
Sarah's question. That's just a comment.
No, I mean, do you have plans to do that? I mean, I just think it's,
I need to defend my dissertation. That's number one. But absolutely, I mean, I really see this as my life's work in so many ways. I received my master's in 2005 and got married around the same time. Had to really think about this. Like, would this be re-triggered? Would this be triggering for me? So my, then boyfriend, now husband, my therapist, other people that I worked with was like, would this be a good idea for me to do? And I really found that I can compartmentalize. That's what helped me survive. I went to school, and when I was at school, like everything was awesome like that. And so to be able to do that. I can tell you I am working on a book, my personal story. I'm working with a person from the Boston Globe, not the Spotlight team, but someone who has worked with Spotlight team. And yeah, there very, very much is a huge opportunity there, and I think so. And there are so many people with amazing stories, and I will say there's so many survivors who are much more public than I am. I like doing the research behind closed doors and then saying, here we go. It's triggering for me, but yeah, I think where we're at, and Christine can definitely speak to this, is I think where we're at is we had this big push of all this stuff happening, and now we're at a point where people have passed a lot, and now I know this is the case with Massachusetts. What's it going to take to kind of get it home to decriminalization? There's a task force, you know, that it was in Massachusetts, it was the Attorney General, Martha Copley, who was really the big push. Now we have Maura Healey, who's wonderful, and at the same time, she has a lot of other priorities. Gun violence, and sure she's been a strong advocate in terms of the Muslim ban, and suing the federal government many times. And so it's like but it's like, who do we find, exactly what you're talking about, that champion to get it back on the table? And I know those, it's prime for that, and I felt we'll just keep going. Yeah.
I mean, that's another question that I also had a question, which is what do we know about the costs of this decriminalization versus criminalization? Do we know anything about the costs of?
Of how many, yeah, in terms of, I mean, I would.
Then the other, I don't know if the states in the US keep the data on fatality among sex-trafficked children. So do you think that has any influence on what?
I don't, unfortunately. I don't think it, well, I will say this, within Massachusetts, that's what started the movement in terms of addressing child sex trafficking, was the death of a child who was in foster care. And at the same time, to me, this is where the bridge between child and adult disappears, because so many people who are trafficked as adults start being trafficked as children, and that people end up in dumpsters, you know, and we don't hear about it. Like, it's just not, particularly children of color, I think. It's a disposable thing again. So in terms of that, or even the cost, I would just look to in terms of the cost to arresting and incarcerating a child, you know, in the state.
Okay, because I mean, we can also think of the lifetime cost.
Absolutely, right.
And that can push the
Yes.
agenda of, I mean, decriminalization.
Yeah.
Right, that's very.
I would just follow up on case kind of in response to that, in terms of, I mean, tracking fatality would also actually involve us being able to be far more effective at identifying child sex trafficking in the first place.
Exactly.
And then part of that is also having accurate definitions of trafficking, making sure that we're not missing the runaway homes who are identified. In terms just of a resource on the cause, in terms of what is happening yes, it's resource intensive to remove criminal liability, but there was research done by the Indian Women's Resource Center, if I'm saying the name correctly, out of Minnesota. And this was actually part, I think, in conjunction with No Wrong Door. They actually did work with an economics firm to do a cost benefit analysis to look at early intervention services, and the sort of moderate assessment was that for every dollar spent on early intervention services for commercially sexually exploited youth, they're saving $34. So there's, that really helps show that.
Good.
That was the online question.
Yeah, there was, what was?
Yes, so that was about, well, are there any current empowerment style re-entry models specifically focused on survivors that are leading the way in criminal justice reform?
Absolutely. I mean, that's what My Life, My Choice and GEMS, they are literally the gold standard. They're completely and utterly survivor informed. GEMS was founded by Rachel Lloyd, the survivor. My Life, My Choice was not founded by survivors. However, Audrey Morrissey, that's when I talk about these amazing advocates who are so out there. She is associate director, and every single thing that they do is completely 100% survivor informed.
Another model I'll point to is California is another state that has removed criminal liability, and through their CSEC action team, they have a survivor advisory board, which is really just an amazing way to make sure that survivors are informing the development policy and implementation of the price as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's what at Baldwin,
Oh, yeah.
Missy, Orvis House, in Virginia, DC, they're also very much, and there's another in California. Sorry, I don't really do
There
drug
are,
services.
there are a number of survivor-led organizations around the country, providing direct services to child trafficking victims.
Okay. One last question. Okay.
Speaking kind of again to the consequences, I just have a question. So in states where, let's say it's decriminalized, however, there's no funding for services, what is happening to victims? Like are they re-entering the system? Like where do they fall?
I think so, that's a very real challenge. We've seen states take a number of approaches. So anytime we have the opportunity to work on advocacy and advocate for a law, it has to be a two-step dance. We're not going to advocate and say, okay, let's just amend the prostitution law, say that doesn't apply to kids, and then we're done. It's just not an adequate response. And I appreciate my question because I always appreciate the opportunity to clarify this. The two have to go together because what's the goal? What is the goal of removing that criminal liability? It's to make sure that we're addressing the underlying trauma and that we're not arresting kids and re-traumatizing them, and creating also a barrier in effect to accessing services that address the underlying trauma, which of course is what often involves kids, again, in the juvenile justice or criminal justice system later, even oftentimes coming in on other offenses as well. So yes, the services are a critical component of that process. However, that's the hard part. That's the part where you have to, committing resources. In terms of, so one way we look at it with our advocacy is that this is a goalpost. And so some states have actually will work on creating the services and developing, convening work groups and figuring out what are we going to do? What is our avenue of services? Also starting to look at multidisciplinary approaches and looking at the fact that this is also very much a community-based problem and a local, and that we having one residential center in the middle of the state that serves CSEC youth and does work, but that's not going to solve the problem for the state. So states are actually looking at regional, for Minnesota as an example, they have the regional navigators. Tennessee has actually divided the state into 4 sections, and each section of the state has a single point of contact who then connects with that survivor and connects them to services. And then they can also refer. So if a child is identified in the western part of the state, but their family and their resources are in the western part of the state, then they have a single point of contact there. And then, they're just really, it's something that states are doing to sort of take this and realize that we have, there's oftentimes we're also seeing concentration of services in urban areas, but we know that this is happening in rural areas, and so there needs to be that really broad-based response.
And just a quick follow-up, this might be a loaded question, but is there any one state that you can identify that's, as far as implementation and effectiveness, is doing it in a optimal way?
I think it's hard to answer with one model, just because some states have more they've made more progress because they've been doing this longer. So states that have sort of enacted a lawsuit longer time ago, I think Minnesota, with going back to 2011, was when they enacted their law. So they got this process started a while ago. They've got the regional navigators. They've been doing this. They have implementation. They did as actually a report. And this is also very good news, the assessment and evaluation of what is happening, so that you can really see where there are gaps. And that's why we do protection assistance challenges, to find the gaps and what we need to fix. And so same thing with implementing the law. In terms of, though Minnesota has that benefit, but there are other states that are kind of, are able to build on that and then maybe take a little, different approach and try something new. There's a lot we encourage really states to be able to learn from each other too.
I would just also add, I think there are states who would love to be doing, even better if they had the resources. I keep mentioning my life, my choice, but their wait list is 6 months. They can only do so much. They would love to have an office. So they're in Boston, they would love to have an office in Springfield, but where's the money, for that? And so those are those challenges we can have. That's like, how are they doing? Yes, but then to me, it's like relative based to what their capacity is, and what they would love to be doing. The other piece I would like to add to that, though, is that even when we're thinking about, how are kids doing, or how are states doing, we often don't include the fact that running away is a very integral part of exiting. Rochelle Dalla is a wonderful researcher at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln that her study, she found exactly the same as domestic violence, that average the leaving 7 times. You need to leave 7 times. In order to finally exit. It's that feeling like being done is very similar. But then we put that back on. I think that's where it goes back to this, that kids are somehow culpable of their crime. Because, okay, so we're here to save them, white knight coming in to save the day, we're here to help them, but they don't want help, they want to go back. But this is where we think about trafficking in terms of that, this is where people think that the trafficking is where it's like the trauma has started. No. This is the kids who are actually, of course, these are the kids who are being trafficked because they have all of this trauma beforehand. They're right. They're obedient. They know they are the perfect kids, to being trafficked. So even the ones who are trafficked, they have the opportunity to leave or they're receiving services, they're probably going to run. And that's actually, this might be a good agenda, I know we're running the end of time, this is how I actually became so interested in policy. Is that so in terms of we're talking about Florida was very gradual in terms of changing their laws. A paper that I wrote when I was working at the Wellesley Centers for Women before I started graduate school, they found my paper online and ended up calling me during the legislative session because they had a safe harbor law, but the state legislators were introducing provisions because they found that 46% of the kids who were receiving services were running away. And so they were introducing legislation to have to lock kids up involuntarily while receiving services. And the advocacy organization that was very much part of the legislative session literally called me sitting in a Whole Foods parking lot. I thought they were just calling to get my advice. I only found out later that they were calling me during the legislative session. And they said that literally that when they were able to talk about my work and with the being survivor based, as well as I think also the social capital, the fact that it was published when I was at Wellesley, that it was just like, no, this is very much the natural progression. This is what's going on. So that it's very natural for this to happen. That's also very difficult, to quote unquote sell to legislators, sell to law enforcement, but that's where the trauma-informed piece comes in. That's where the gender-based piece comes in. That we have all of these other, it's this perfect storm of all of these things. It's not, to me, it's cut and dry, but when you're trying to sell it in the policy arena, and in the political arena, it gets really complicated on top of the umbrella of these are children that we're talking about, so there's very much this emotional response. But then I could do a whole other talk of, who's seen as the innocent victim, that's exactly what my dissertation is called, defining worthy victims. Who is worthy of this protection? And it's certainly not every child under 18, that's for sure. And that's exactly why I do this work.
Okay, we want to bring it on here.
That's a good place to end, isn't it?
Thanks, panelists, for the wonderful work. I think we should put our hands to take that. Thanks everybody who joined online as well. Yet I don't want us to end the discussion here, so please find a way to continue to engage in the interesting discussion. I also want to use the opportunity to wish resources in many parts of our work. So we'll be looking forward to that. Please also watch out for other sessions that will be hosted, and please sign up and come. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.